You are listening to WTUZ Radio Podcast. Welcome to WTUZ Radio Podcast. I am your host, Rhonda. And today's podcast, let's talk about reparations. Who, what, and why. Now, last week there was a bit of a rumble about a couple folks coming out against reparations, and then a couple folks that are for reparations. So just to be clear, when I speak on reparations, there's been a conversation for quite some time about melanated people, aka African Americans, receiving reparations. All right. So now, and to receive those reparations based on slavery. All right. So meaning ancestors being enslaved. All right. So we're going to get into this. For some of you, this is not, some of you that are familiar with me, familiar with the platform, this will be no surprise to you. For those of you that are new to the platform, this will be a surprise to you. So for all, I am going to give the reasons why I am going in the direction that I am going in. And I'm also going to prove to you why it will never happen. Okay, so let's start with an article that just came out in the BBC in 2019. Should Black Americans get slavery reparation? How does a country recover from centuries of slavery and racism? In the U.S., a growing number of voices are saying the answer is reparations. Reparations are restitution for slavery, and apology and repayment to Black citizens whose ancestors were forced into the slave trade. Okay. It's a policy notion that many Black academics and advocates have long called for, but one that politicians have largely sidestepped or ignored. And we're going to get into why they're sidestepping and ignoring. But increase activism around racial inequalities, and discussing among Democrat 2020 president candidates have thrust the issue into the national spotlight. This week, talk of reparations made headlines after a Fox News contributor argued against the policy by saying that the U.S. actually deserved more credit for ending slavery as quickly as it did. Okay, although that's a piss poor argument, but we're going to get into why folks are sidestepping. America came along as the first country to end it within 150 years, and we get no credit for that, Katie Pavlich said on Tuesday, adding that reparations would only inflame racial tensions even more. Okay, so even that particular part isn't true about America being the first. The backlash to her comments from liberals and activists was swift. Bernice King, daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., responded by saying America doesn't deserve credit for ending slavery when the ideologies are still prevalent. Okay, so they're going to go into the history. The talk of repaying African Americans has been around since the Civil War era, when centuries of slavery officially ended. Some experts have calculated the worth of Black labor during slavery as anywhere from billions to trillions of dollars. Adding in exploitative, low-income work post-slavery pushes those figures even higher. Even after the technical end of the slave trade, Black Americans were denied education, voting rights, and the right to own property, treated in many ways as second-class citizens. Those arguing for reparations point to these historical inequalities as reasons for current schisms between white and black Americas when it comes to income, housing, healthcare, and incarceration rates. Professor Derek Hamilton, executive director of Ohio State's Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, says this history is part of the America's unique problem. From our founding fabric, we have based our politics and economic institutions on chattel slavery, he told BBC, which makes our institution not only pernicious, but structurally entrenched in inequalities. All right, so they're going to give a brief history of slavery. They're saying a timeline. 1619, some of the first African slaves are purchased in Virginia by English colony through slaves. Those slaves had been used by European colonists long before. Okay, so kind of keep paying attention to their timeline of slavery, because when I get into the whys, you're going to go, oh, okay. 1788, the U.S. Constitution is ratified. Under it, slaves are considered by law to be 3/5 of a person. 1808, President Thomas Jefferson officially ends the African slave trade, but domestic slave trade, particularly in the southern states, began to grow. This one is really, really important, although they're still twisting it. Okay. But we're going to come back to this. 1822, freed African Americans found Liberia in West Africa as a new home for freed slaves. Okay, we'll address that. Abraham Lincoln becomes the first president of the U.S. The southern states succeeded, and the Civil War began the following year. 1862, President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation frees all slaves in the seceded states. 1865, the South loses the war. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution formally abolishes slavery. 1868, the 14th Amendment grants free African American citizenship. 1870, the 15th Amendment gives African American men the right to vote. The South begins passing segregation laws. And then it goes in arguing for reparations. Professor Hamilton says the impact of slavery continues to manifest in American society. The material consequence is vivid with the racial wealth gap. Psychologically, the consequence is how we treat blacks without dignity, that we dehumanize them in public spaces. From policies excluding primarily black populations, like Social Security once did, to pushing narratives that blame black Americans for their economic problems. Professor Hamilton says the U.S. has structural problems that must be addressed in order to move forward. So it's given a chart on household incomes by race, and it starts in 1967, and you can just see the gap, meaning melanated/black folks' income is vastly lower, almost half, than their Caucasian, aka white counterparts. In 2014, journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates brought similar ideas into the national conversation with his piece, The Case for Reparations. Coates detailed how housing policy and wealth gaps in particular most clearly illustrate the ways black citizens are still affected by Americans' past. Decades of segregation kept black families away from white areas, which had better access to education, healthcare, food, and other necessities, while institutionalized discrimination hindered black Americans' economic development. As we further go back in our history, one can see it as explicitly violent, Professor Hamilton says, now it might be implicitly violent. Subconscious racism in police forces, enduring bias against Black Americans in the courts and financial institutions are some examples of that subtle violence, he adds. Okay, so we're going to get down to the support for reparations today remains largely divided along racial lines. A 2016 March poll found 58% of Black Americans were in favor of reparations, while 81% of white Americans opposed the idea. A 2018 Data for Progress survey also found reparations to be unpopular among the general public, and especially so among white Americans. One argument against reparation echoes what Fox Miss Palvich said, that they would only build walls between Americans. Some contend that the reason reparations have worked elsewhere, namely Germany, which has paid billions to Holocaust survivors since the end of World War II, is because the reparations are between nations, not within one. For the United States to do the same for the descendants of slaves would be to imply that afterwards we will be going our separate ways with no special obligation on either side. Columnist Megan McArdle wrote for the Washington Post. Now pay attention to what they're saying the definition of the reparations are. A one-time payment and then nothing more owed. That is the only concept of reparations that could possibly be politically viable. Now, those that are for reparations, specifically melanated folk, aka Black folk, aka African Americans, I want you to listen to what I'm saying carefully. This is the definition that is being put out for reparations. A one-time payment and then nothing more owed. That is the only conception of reparations that could possibly be politically viable. It would be utterly toxic, ultimately widening division that we're trying to shrink. All right. What I wanted you to pay attention to is the one-time payment. Okay, but we're going to get a little deeper into this. Even for some Black activists, reparations seem an unreasonable ask. Bayard Rustin, who organized the March on Washington and was a friend of Martin Luther King Jr., called it a ridiculous idea. If my great-great-grandfather picked cotton for 50 years, then he may deserve some money, but he's dead and gone, and nobody owes me anything, Mr. Rustin told the New York Times in 1969. So somebody that was cool on the King, Dr. Martin Luther King side said that? All right, let's continue. He later expanded on the views, writing that a payout would demean the integrity the integrity of Blacks and exploit white guilt. We're still going to get a little deeper into this once I start bringing out these facts. All right. It is insulting to Negroes to offer them reparations for past generations for suffering, as if the balance of an irreparable past could be set straight with a handout. How reparations work. A monetary payout. I want y'all to pay attention. You African Americans, melanated people, Black people, I want you to pay attention to, they keep talking about a monetary payout. A monetary payout to Black Americans usually come to mind when discussing reparations in the U.S., and critics are quick to point out that such a payment would cost the U.S. trillions. But just throwing cash at the issue, advocates say, would not address the root of the problem. Professor Hamilton told the BBC he supports a payout mostly as a symbolic gesture. In any case, Where there's an injustice, to achieve justice, not only do you need the acknowledgement, you need the restitution. We need to couple it with an economic justice bill of rights, he adds. Simply paying the debt doesn't address the structural problems America has with certain classes of Americans being able to extract and exploit. All right, so I want y'all to remember all of this. They're talking about white guilt, payouts, extract and exploit. But acknowledgement isn't trivial, he said. It would help refute existing narratives that dehumanizing Black Americans as lazy or dysfunctional. Economics William Darity has also suggested a portfolio of reparations that would combine payments with Black-oriented policies focusing on funding Black education, healthcare, and asset building, as well as ensuring that public schools properly teach the full impact of slavery. Child, this article just gets worse and worse. And once I start going into the truth, you'll see why this article gets worse and worse. So William Darity now suggests pretty much programs, because that's what he's saying. Okay. What have Democrats candidates said? President Barack Obama never endorsed a reparations policy, nor did 2016 candidate Hillary Clinton, but next year presidential contenders have been more outspoken. Kamala Harris has said she's in favor of some type of reparations. So all of you all that voted for Biden and Harris, remember what she said. Now, she's not going to stick to it. Just remember what she said. All right. In February, she told the Grail, we have to recognize that everybody did not start out on equal footing in this country, and in particularly Black people have not. She has proposed the LIFT Act, which would give families earning under $100,000 annually a tax credit benefiting 60% of the Black families who are in poverty. The California Democrats also suggested policies investing in Black communities through Black colleges and healthcare programs, for example. Okay, Elizabeth Warren has also expressed support for reparations, calling racial injustice a stain on America that has happened generation after generation. All right, so here's what she's saying. Because of housing discrimination and employment discrimination, we live in a world where the average white family has $100 and the average Black family has about $5. It's time to start the national full-blown conversations about reparations in this country. Ms. Warren said she's in favor of a bill currently in the House of Representatives to appoint a panel of experts to report back to Congress about what can be done to solve these issues. Okay, so you heard what Elizabeth Warren said. Here's Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders saw some backlash during the last presidential election over rejecting the idea, but he maintains that a reparation check would not fix the problem. Right now, our job is to address the crises facing American people and our communities. And I think there are better ways to do that than just writing a check. Mr. Sanders said rather than supporting a payout, he is in favor of universal programs or anti-poverty measures that would help all underprivileged communities. All right, let's see what Cory Booker said. Like Ms. Harris has proposed a form of reparations. Baby bonds would create a trust fund for lower income children and they could use for education or housing. As more Black families are impoverished than whites, the policy would help address racial inequalities broadly speaking. Former San Antonio Mayor Julian Castro said the idea of reparations was something worth discussing. Mr. Castro said he is also in favor of an expert panel that could study the issue and inform Congress how best to proceed. All right, and then author Marianne Williamson has said she supports a reparational plan. She has floated the idea of $100 billion educational, economic, and cultural fund to be dispersed over a 10-year period by a council of esteemed African American leaders. To Professor Hamilton, regardless of policy, the fact that these conversations are happening is a step forward. The conversation in and of itself is valuable. It's opening the door to reframe our understanding of racial inequality. Okay, so again, this was an article from the BBC News. March 2019, should Black Americans get reparations for slavery? All right. So, just real quick, this came out last week, where now President Obama, this is out of the Daily Mail, although it was all over the news media last week, where now President Obama calls for reparations for Black Americans because the wealth of this country was built on the back of slaves, but says he couldn't get it done as president due to the politics of white resistance. Former President Obama claimed reparations for Black Americans are justified, but explained in his podcast with Bruce Springsteen that it was a non-starter during his presidency because of white resistance. During his 2008 presidential campaign, Obama appeared to oppose reparations and argued that the best reparations we can provide are good schools in the inner city and jobs for people who are unemployed. Now, I'll pause for a second and just remind folks, he did neither. Okay, the reparations, that's a separate topic. We're going to get into a little bit more deeper of why it'll never happen. And if it does happen, here is the cost, the true cost behind it happening. All right. But President O said to provide good schools in the inner city and jobs. You didn't even do that. Obama 59 has launched an 8-episode podcast series called Renegades, born in the U.S. with the 71-year-old rock legend, released through Spotify's partnership with the Obama Higher Ground production company. In the second episode released on Monday, Obama and Springsteen spoke about race relations in the United States. Okay. All right. Springsteen asked Obama how he could hold the same country that sent a man to the moon is the same country of the Jim Crow laws, which were state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation and marginalized Black Americans. All right. So I'm not going to read through the rest of this. Because I want to get into the real reason behind the divide on reparations. Now, I'm talking from a political perspective, because those in politics, now I'm not going to say everybody in politics, but those higher up in politics, they absolutely know why reparations is not only controversial, but they cannot be paid out the way it is being suggested, meaning that melanated people, aka Black, aka African Americans, can receive a blanket payout. Okay? They know the real reason why. And if there is a blanket payout, you better believe there's going to be a catch to it. And you ask, well, Rhonda, why is that? Because here's the biggest secret. Now, those of you that have rocked with me, you already know where I'm going with that. Okay? So this is just a reminder to you all. And it's also, if you are so happen to be in conversations with folks, especially those ADOS groups that's talking about reparations, thinking that they're speaking for all of melanated people, you can have a conversation based on facts versus their conversation based on facts versus fiction, fact and fiction, because they have a little bit of facts, and their little bit of facts is based on the conditions of today. That we all know is factual. But the part that is fiction is what really the crust of their argument for reparations is. It's based on slavery. That's the fictional part of the story on who did what when. So let's get to it. Now, let's start with the myth. It's not a fact. It is a myth that white folks, specifically white Europeans, started colonization. All right? So particularly colonization around the world, and specifically in this case that we're speaking on, the colonization in America. That's just not so. You know why it's not so? Because whites, aka Caucasians, did not hold the seat of power. Yeah, that's right. Whites, aka Caucasians, did not hold the seat of power during colonization. There were melanated European kings and queens that held the seat of power. Okay? So, good source of read. There's plenty of resources out there, but two that I've become fond of when it's regarding the melanated thrones over in Europe, because it's well put together, gives its sources, and it's an easy read. You should literally be able to give this book to a high schooler, a middle schooler, and they would get a lot out of it. All right. And it's a quick read, and it gives you the sources where you can dig even deeper for more information. So the first one I'm going to go to is the Negro Question Part 4, The Missing Link. This is by Lee Cummings. And in this book, this particular author, he goes into the genealogy of the European throne. And he proves that the throne of Europe was held by melanated folk. All right, so I'm just going to start on page 8 of his book. And again, this is the Negro Question Part 4, The Missing Link by Lee Cummings. I'm just going to start on Part 8 to just give you a quick high level of the genealogy of these melanated, aka black kings. The Scottish kings of England. Right? So in this particular on page 2, he provides the true image of King James, who's clearly melanated. And this image is from the New College Library at Edinburgh, UK. I know that this image of a black King James can be a little confusing, but of your Western education. But this is the truth that is known by the rich and elite in the world. That was the reason I paraded all of the English historians and professors before you, because I got into the bowels of this book. before I got into the bowels of this book. I had to get your mind ready to receive the truth. King James came from a long line of Black Scottish Stuart kings. 343 years of rulership in Scotland. The Stuarts are not only ruled in Scotland, they ruled in France, Spain, Ireland, England, Britain, Wales. Okay, so I'm just going to go back over that again, okay, because I want you all to clearly understand when we're having this conversation of reparations about why folks should be receiving what and why I am telling you that it'll never happen. And if it does happen, there's going to be a stipulation to it. Let me just read that just a little bit, this little sentence again. King James came from a long line of Black Scottish Stuart kings. 343 years of rulership in Scotland. The Stuarts not only ruled in Scotland, they ruled in France, Spain, Ireland, and England, Britain, and Wales. King James was able to rule all of these lands because all of these people were of Iberian Black descent. They were the same people. If you look at the ball in his hand, it represents the world rulership, and there were only one other group of world leaders who used that type of symbolism, and they were the Byzantine Roman emperors. You see what he's proving to you all? How far back these melanated bloodlines go in reference to rulership? Remember, they told the English that they were Roman citizens. This is the proof. There was another man who made the same boast, and if you have wisdom, you know who I'm talking about. This is one of the signs of scholarship, when you are able to read the symbolism of images. In my research, I found out that the ancient Scottish were a tribe from northeastern Ireland, which means the Scots are really Irish. So if I have seen an ancient Scot, I have seen an ancient Irishman. And if I have seen an ancient Irishman, then I have seen an ancient Britain. Okay, so he goes into the list of Scottish kings. Robert II, from 1371 to 1390, Robert III until 1406, James I until 1437. Now, these are all melanated, folks. Let's keep this in mind. James II to 1460, James III until 1488, James IV until 1513, James V until 1542, Mary, Queen of Scots until 1567, James the Sixth, James the Sixth and First of England until 1625. Okay, so just to refresh your memory, let me go back to that first article when it started breaking down the timeline. 1619, some of the first African slaves are purchased in Virginia by English colonists through slaves have been used by European colonists long before. Okay, so I'm going down the list of these European monarchs who are melanated. Okay? So who was ruling in that 1619 period? It was James VI. Okay, then after James, you had the Charles era. Charles came in 1629 to 1649. Then the second was 1685. And then James and Mary, 1694. And then Anne, it was 1707. Okay. But now, according to their timeline, 1619, because they love to use that 1619 date. That's when the first African slaves, that's what they say now, are purchased in Virginia. But black monarch was in power. To listen to this episode in its entirety, go to anchor.fm/WTUZ radio. Again, that's anchor.fm/WTUZ radio. And the link is in the description. Thank you, and peace and love.